Okay, we are in a series on the books of the Bible. So we are going to go all the way through from Genesis to Job, and then we're going to stop and we're going to do something else. And then the plan is next summer to come back to this series. So eventually, probably over the next 4 years, we're going to go through every book of the Bible. There are 66 books of the Bible, so that's why it's taking 4 years, and we're only doing it in the summer. Oh, all of it. We're going to cover the whole Bible tonight, the entire Bible. So last week we did the book of Genesis, and this week we are doing the book of Exodus, which is the second book. So, how many of you took vocabulary tests at school? Yeah, where you got the word on one side and then the definition on the other side? How many of you were teachers and had to grade those where the lines were erased out but ineffectively, and then there's multiple lines going from one to the other? And yeah? All right. So I'm not going to give you a test, or maybe I will. No, I'm not going to give you a test, but we are going to cover some vocabulary words today, because in the church, we use a lot of words. Often, we don't even remember really what they mean. We use them as we go along, or maybe you're new to the church and you've never heard the word before, and so we kind of lose some communication because these words that we use don't really hold any meaning anymore, or they never held meaning, or you know exactly what they meant, and that's okay. We're just going to review them anyway. So for this vocabulary review, we're going to cover 4 words. And the first word is a reflection back on last week. Previously on the books of the Bible. We have the book of Genesis. And in the book of Genesis, God at various points makes covenants. And our first word is covenant. And the word covenant is covenant. I'm saying it really fast. The word covenant means an agreement, a relationship agreement. So when God makes his covenant with Abraham, he's entering into a relationship with Abraham where he's saying, I'm going to make you into a great nation. And then, and what he's asking from Abraham is that Abraham follow him and do the things that he's inviting him into, which are all pretty scary things. And but we covered that all last week, so I got to move on. This book's 40 chapters long, guys. It was longer last week, but this book's 40 chapters long, and we got to cover the whole thing. So I got to move on. So the word covenant, so there's this agreement, this relationship agreement that God enters into with Abraham. And then we see that, and it's for Abraham and his descendants. So Abraham's son is Isaac, and the same relationship exists between Isaac and God. And then Isaac's son is Jacob, and the same thing happens. And through all of these people, we see this pattern begin to develop where God establishes a relationship with them, a covenant with them, and then they fail in their part of it. And then God comes through for them and saves them, and then they fail, and then it happens over. It's this cycle. And this goes on through the whole Bible. And we're going to see it some today in Exodus. So Jacob it's Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons, and the 12 sons the 11 of the sons take one of the sons, and they sell him into slavery, which is not very nice. And he goes off to Egypt, and in Egypt, as a slave, he rises up to be the number 2 in command in all of Egypt, just under Pharaoh, who's the king of Egypt. It's a vocab word for another time, Pharaoh. But Joseph is the number 2 in Egypt, and then he saves a bunch of people from famine, and then his brothers come and he saves them from famine, and relationship is restored, and it's all very nice, and the whole family, including Jacob and the 70 people in his family, moved to Egypt. And so now they're in Egypt. And that's where Exodus begins, sort of. So, "400 years pass, and the people of God are still in Egypt." And I'm going to be kind of jumping through the book of Exodus because there is a lot to cover, and I'm not going to get to all the stories. But I would really love to. And the reason I'd really love to get to all the stories is because when I was a kid, I would start basically with Genesis, and I would read about halfway through Exodus, and then it got really confusing, so I skipped. And I skipped forward to Joshua, because Joshua begins the books of history, and it's all stories, and it's great. So then I would read Joshua and Judges and Ruth and go all the way through to Chronicles, and then Chronicles, there's some kind of boring stuff that I didn't like when I was a kid. And then I'd jump, and Ezra and Nehemiah were harder, but I liked Esther. And I never read Job when I was a kid, because that was weird. But basically, I love stories. I loved the stories and getting to see all of these people do these things in relationship with God. And I read through them like, I don't know how many times, because it just was this like the stories were so good and rich, and I didn't understand a lot of them, which is why it was okay that I read them all, because some of them have really scary things in them. But then later, when I was a freshman in college, I did a study on the book of Hebrews. And the book of Hebrews, which is in the New Testament, kind of lays out the way that what God's relationship with his people throughout the Old Testament, the way it fits into what Jesus did, and the way that God, through Jesus, saves his people in a way that wasn't present in the Old Testament. It all builds up to Jesus. So I really loved these stories, and there's lots of stories, and we're not going to get to them all. And we're going to get to less of them because I took the time to tell you that. But, so the people, Jacob's children, the Hebrew people, are enslaved in Egypt, and they're there for 400 years, and they're in slavery, and then along comes this guy named Moses. And Moses is really cool. Pharaoh tried to kill all the male babies born to Hebrew women in Egypt, and some really cool stuff happens, and you should go read it because it's really exciting. But I'm not going to get into that. Basically, what happens is Moses' mother saves him and sends him on the river, down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him, and Pharaoh's daughter takes him in, and he's raised up, and he grows up. He actually grows up with his... I'm getting into the stories too much. I gotta move on. But Moses grows up, and when he's older, there's an Egyptian that's beating some Hebrew slaves, and Moses kills him, and then he's afraid that Pharaoh will find out, and that Pharaoh's going to come after him, and so he leaves. And he flees Egypt, and he's out of Egypt for a long time, until that Pharaoh dies, and the people who were looking for him die. And that's basically where our story is going to pick up. So we're in chapter 3, Exodus chapter 3, which is the passage that we just read. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that through the bush, though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." So what we see here is that God is faithful to his covenant that he made with Abraham. He sees his people in suffering, in slavery, and he says, "I'm going to go and save them." And Exodus is really, if Genesis is about making a covenant with Abraham, Exodus is about reestablishing that covenant with Abraham's descendants, about making them into a people and bringing them together and saying, "I am your God." And so Moses, God says, "So now I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." So through this covenant relationship that he has with Abraham, God calls Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." If you don't, so let's see, what is that? The Ten Commandments movie, Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston? Yeah, Charlton Heston. Did any of you watch The Prince of Egypt? Yeah? I grew up watching The Prince of Egypt. That was a fun movie. It's got some issues. So Moses goes to Pharaoh, and there's a lot of other stuff that happens with his brother Aaron and the people, the Hebrew people. But eventually Moses gets before Pharaoh, and he says, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh says no. Because why? Right? He's got slaves. He doesn't want to let them go. Why would he? Well, this, if you remember in the Ten Commandments or Prince of Egypt, or if you've just read the book of Exodus, is where the Ten Commandments come in, or the Ten Commandments. Man, 10 plagues. All right, the 10 plagues. So, in the first 5 plagues, what we see is Pharaoh. So the first 5 plagues are the plague of blood, the plague of frogs, the plague of gnats, the plague of flies, and the plague on livestock. And what these are is God coming into Egypt and saying, "I am God." Each of these reflect back on one of the Egyptian gods, and it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart against what Moses was asking. He hardened his heart against God. And so, as God shows his power, the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh hardens his heart. And then the second 5 plagues, we see in the book of Psalms, there's a passage where it says that the miraculous signs that God did in Egypt for the glory of his name. And so, after the plague on livestock, we have the plague of boils, the plague of hail, the plague of locusts, and the plague of darkness. Those are the next 4. And after each of those, it said God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It doesn't say Pharaoh hardened his heart. It said God hardened Pharaoh's heart. In this, God shows his power. God shows his people his power to save and to draw them out of slavery. And so we come to our second vocab word. So what was our first one? See how I did that so I could take a drink of water? First one was covenant. Second one is Passover. So the plague of the firstborn, which is the 10th plague, God said, "I'm going to send the angel of the Lord, and the firstborn of Egypt will die." This is incredibly sad and impactful. But God goes to his people and tells Moses, tell the people to make a sacrifice. Sacrifice a lamb and take the blood of the lamb and put it on the doorposts and put it over the door. And when the angel of the Lord comes, it will pass over the house. And then they were told to make unleavened bread, to make bread without yeast. And the idea is that the bread with yeast takes a long time to make, and they didn't have a lot of time because this was going to happen, and then they were going to have to run out of Egypt. And in chapter 12, Exodus 12, 17 and 18 says, celebrate the feast of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. In the first month, you are to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. So God commands them to celebrate the feast of the Passover. This is the first of many feasts that we're going to look at in later books. There's all these feasts where people come and in relationship with God. But this is the first one. It's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's Passover. It's the Passover meal. The Passover meal is the meal that Jesus was partaking in the night that he was betrayed, the night that he was arrested and crucified, the night that he died for our sins. The meal that he was eating was the Passover. And there's this beautiful reflection on beautiful and tragic and sad reflection on the need for this sacrifice to save the people out of Egypt, the need for Christ's sacrifice to save us out of the brokenness of this world. But it goes on. So the celebration, so the sacrifice of Christ, if he had been crucified and then died, and if that was the end, that sacrifice, it wouldn't mean anything. We wouldn't know about it. There were actually a few other people at the time around, not at the time of Jesus, but within like 200 years of Jesus, who also said that they were the Messiah, but when they died, they died. They stayed dead. And the reason we celebrate, what gives impact and meaning to the sacrifice of Christ, is that he was resurrected. And the same thing happens in Exodus. So the people, they make the sacrifice of the Passover meal, and then the firstborn of Egypt are killed, including Pharaoh's own son, and Pharaoh says, leave, go, get out of here. And they leave, and they're leaving Egypt, and they come to the Red Sea. And the chariots of Egypt, Pharaoh decides, well, that was dumb. I don't want to let them go. I'm angry. I'm going to get them back. And so he goes and he chases them down. And there's this moment where if they had been standing at the Red Sea and they have the sea on one side and the chariots of Egypt on the other, and Pharaoh just comes in and destroys the people and then takes the survivors back into slavery, we wouldn't have this story. We wouldn't know about it. But what happens is Moses raises up his staff and the water parts and they walk through on dry land, and then the chariots of Egypt follow behind and the water crashes down and the people are saved. This is the moment that is reflected on in the Psalms, in the songs of Israel. This is the moment that they celebrate most often in song is crossing the Red Sea. It is what affirms the salvation out of slavery from Egypt. And when they get across on the other side, Moses and his sister Miriam lead the people in song. And it's actually this passage, this the salvation from the sea is actually mentioned in the Psalms, in particular in 66, 74, 77, and 78. Like, it's directly mentioned and celebrated and sung about. So we have to move on. But covenant, Passover, and then some cool things happen in the desert. It's very exciting. They don't have water. They get water. They don't have food. They get food. They complain about the food and they want meat. God sends quail. A bunch of stuff happens. Very exciting. Read the story. They come then to the mountain where Moses was called. And in Exodus chapter 19, we have this word from God. Oops, how did I skip forward to Leviticus? Sorry. All right. Exodus chapter 19. In the 3rd month, after the Israelites left Egypt, on the very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." And so God calls them out of Egypt, saves them out of Egypt, and they come to the mountain, and God reestablishes his covenant with the people of Israel. And he says, "This is what I did for your fathers, and this is what I do for you, and what I ask is that you follow me. You obey my commands." So this is our 3rd vocab word. It's very simple, easy to spell. It is the law. We talk about the law a fair amount, a lot. And the law is really, when we look at the first 5 books, it says, you see, if you can see really small, if you have good eyesight, it says law. The first 5 books, in particular, not so much Genesis, but in particular, the next 4, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, hold the law. And what this is it's the way that Israel was called to enter into the covenant relationship they had with God. It was how they were to interact with God. And we see the beginnings of this with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where they're called to remember what God did for them to call them out of Egypt. And what we're going to see, and what we see even in Exodus, is that the people of God are really bad at this. There's this rhythm to a lot of the books of law where it gives a piece of the law and then it gives a short story about how the people did not live up to it. And then it gives another piece of law and then it gives a short story about how the people fell and failed. And in the book of Exodus, it gives the 10 Commandments and a little bit of the law, and then it talks about the golden calf and how Moses went up the mountain and the people thought he was dead, so they made a golden calf to worship, which is exactly what we do. I mean, this is how we enter into the world. We are called by God, we're offered relationship by God, and we're like, yeah, that sounds great. And now I have my other idol here, and I'm going to build this. And then God calls us back, and then there's this constant reorientation towards God and what he's called us to. But even more than that, if we look at the book of Hebrews, which I said earlier is one of my favorite, I think I said it's one of my favorite books, but it's the study that I did. In the book of Hebrews, in chapter 10, it says, the law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, that have come. not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. What the writer of Hebrews says is that the law was a shadow. The law, this set of commandments oriented towards or building relationship with God, towards entering in and making sacrifices for God or for ourselves to God, can never fully save. And the thing that comes and actually fulfills the covenant and fulfills the law is Christ and Christ's sacrifice. And if we listen to the words of Christ, he says, they ask him, what's the most important commandment? And he says, love God and love your neighbor. He says it's a little bit longer than that, but essentially, it's love God and love your neighbor. The whole of the law is summed up in these two pieces. And what we are called to in relationship with Christ is to love God and love your neighbor. And our relationship with Christ is not dependent on our acts anymore, like it was under the law. Our relationship with God is dependent on the sacrifice that Christ made for us, which is why we can enter into relationship with God. Okay. So what are our three? We've done three so far. We have covenant, Passover, and the law. For our last one, if you really love Exodus, I'm very sorry. We're going to jump to the end. In Exodus, so you get the story is all the way through chapter 19, and then you have some laws, some rules, some things to live by, and then the last 12 chapters of Exodus are about the tabernacle. This is our last vocab word, is tabernacle. Yeah. Yes, this is a church. We're going to, so the word tabernacle, what the last 12 chapters of Exodus are about Moses building this space for God to physically be present with his people. So it has the ark featured in such great movies as Indiana Jones. Has the Ark of the Covenant, which has the rules and the laws, and then there's a tent and a meeting place and an altar, and there's all of these. There's very specific rules for how Moses was to build the tabernacle. And then at the end of Exodus, in chapter 40, it says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel during all their travels." So Moses takes all this time, he gets all these rules from God about how to build the tabernacle, and then he makes it, and it's completed, and he can't go in. It says he can't go in. And that's the end of Exodus. We're not going to get to experience Israel meeting with God in the tabernacle until later. It's coming later. But what we see here, the word tabernacle, is the place in which God would meet with his people, the physical place. It's where God came down in his spirit to interact and have relationship with his people, where they would make the sacrifices, where they would enter into relationship through Moses and through Aaron, and Aaron was Moses' brother, and his descendants are all the priests. But if we look at John, chapter 1, John is one of the Gospels. It's where we learn about Jesus and his story and what he did while he was here. And in John chapter 1, verse 14, it says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." So it says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And another way to say that is the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. It's actually this idea that Christ's coming was the new tabernacle. It was the presence of God here on earth. And through Christ, we now can enter into the tabernacle. We can actually enter into relationship with God through what Jesus did. His presence with us is the tabernacle. And now we don't have a space dedicated to go where if the glory of the Lord is there, then we can't go in because the veil has been torn, and we can actually enter into relationship with God without the tabernacle. He has sent his Spirit to be with us through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So, really quick, do a review. We have covenant, which is relationship with God. And we have Passover, which was the events in Egypt and the remembrance of what God did in Egypt. We have the law, which is how people enter into relationship with God. And then we have tabernacle, which is the presence of God among his people. And we get to see with each part of this how what God did through Jesus fulfills each piece, each vocabulary word, each piece of what we've looked over. So why is this important? Well, it's important, first of all, because of what Jesus did. And his actions here on earth and how he came to fulfill the law and the relationship that God established with his people. But it's also important because it's good for us to read these stories. We have context for these stories because of what Christ did. We have context because of books like Hebrews, which I love. But these stories tell us about times when God established relationship and then people failed. And God still came in and entered into relationship with them. So what I want to invite you into is to tell your story. Stories are powerful and they have impact. They have power to change. And our stories with God and what God has done in our lives have power to change. And if you don't know what God has done in your life, or if you don't have a relationship with God, tell your story anyway. And what I invite you to specifically do tonight is as you eat, as you sit with people and as you have conversations, invite the people around you to tell a piece of their story. It doesn't have to be their whole story. You don't have to listen to their life story and everything, but just ask for a piece of their story. This morning, I don't know how many of you know Wayne and Barbie, but I got to sit and listen to how Wayne and Barbie got married. And it was a beautiful story, and it was only like this really short period of time in their life. But it was beautiful and lovely, and I would invite you to enter into that kind of conversation tonight, telling a piece of your story and allowing people to listen, and then invite them to share back. So we think we don't have time. One question. Yeah.
So I've always had a hard time with that God hardened Pharaoh's heart throughout my life and not really understanding it and putting it together. But recently, I think, I can't remember exactly when, I feel like it was recently, I just realized if he wouldn't have hardened Pharaoh's heart, there wouldn't have been a Passover, and then Jesus couldn't have been the Passover lamb, and the whole redemption story, like, I don't know, I just never connected it. I've grown up in church, and I just never got that, I guess. I don't know why it was never put together, and I figured it out just randomly, probably the Holy Spirit, and then I just was like, oh, okay, God, you are, like, you do have a reason for everything, and anyway, so I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, and I think it's significant that it says that through the first 5 that Pharaoh hardened his heart. And there's sort of the storytelling throughout the Old Testament is very like, I'm going to tell this piece of the story, and then I'm going to tell this piece of the story, and then I'm going to tell this piece of the story, and then I'm going to jump ahead and tell this piece of the story, and then like there's this. It's very often not a direct line of storytelling. But I do think it's significant that Pharaoh in the first 5 says Pharaoh hardened his heart. And I do think it's significant that in the Psalms, it sings about how God brought his own glory through what he did in Egypt.